address the question, who is Gerald Ford? Who is this man? What is at the center of his being? What matters to him? What did he understand? What did he not understand? And I want to begin with a quote from somebody saying the following: "I believe that truth is the glue that holds government together, not only our government, but civilization itself." Now, what sort of First Amendment zealot said that? Thomas Jefferson? Dan Rather? My former boss at the Washington Post, Ben Bradley, saying that truth not only holds the government together, but civilization itself? Said by Gerald Ford on taking the oath of office, August 9th, 1974, as the 38th President of the United States. Ford got it. He understood that you had to be willing to explain and answer questions. So when he was confronted, not with the issue of maybe pardoning Nixon, but a subsidiary, what looked like a subsidiary issue was Nixon requested of the Ford White House in the first weeks that all of his tapes, Nixon's famous tapes, and all of the papers be shipped out to San Clemente so Nixon could have them. And Ford brought in a lawyer named Benton Becker, a young Justice Department lawyer, to look at this issue and the issues of the pardon. And Becker said to Ford, and this is one of the interesting, you're sometimes only as good as your assistants or your advisors. Becker said to Ford, you cannot ship those papers out to San Clemente or those tapes out to San Clemente. It will be the last stage of the cover-up, and we'll never see, we being the public and history, will never see what's in those tapes. What's in those papers. There will all of a sudden be a big bonfire in San Clemente. And Ford thought about this and said to Becker finally that history must be preserved, and he ordered him, he said, do whatever you have to do, but it must be preserved. I'm not shipping that stuff out. And he didn't. And they made a deal with Nixon. And we now have all of those Nixon tapes. As you may know, every season there's a new batch of those Nixon tapes that's released to the public. At the Washington Post, we call it the gift that keeps giving. And we have Gerald Ford to thank for that. And the importance, if you put it on scales, and now, decades later, we really can. Was it more important to have a Nixon trial to learn if he'd been charged criminally versus having all of those tapes and all of those papers and all of that information? It's obvious. The tapes and the papers are the story of Nixon for history. It was Ford who said no. And, instead of saying something, he said it in his way, and this is an authentic quote, I'm not shipping that stuff out. That's Jerry Ford. That's the way he talked. His first State of the Union address, January 15th, 1975, as president, so he'd been president 5 months, said the following, and he recounted how he had been in the audience as a congressman in 1949 when a president named Harry Truman delivered the State of the Union that year. And so in his State of the Union in 1975, President Ford said, today that freshman member from Michigan stands where Mr. Truman stood. And I must say to you that the State of the Union is not good. Now I want to speak bluntly. I've got very bad news. I don't expect much, if any, applause. And then Ford went on to, what did he do? Told the truth. The economy was in trouble. There were all kinds of difficulties. And now, think back, it's not that far, to the happy talk of lots of presidents. I won't name them. Who get up, everything is wonderful, everything is perfect. Imagine in 2006 or 2008 or whenever, president getting up there and saying, I must say to you that the state of the union is not good. Ford, truth. Very important to understand that part of his personality. When he was president, he gave press conferences regularly, gave about the same number of press conferences Nixon did, who had well over twice the time in office. Ford initiated, again, this is classic kind of direct Midwestern approach, the follow-up question at presidential press conferences. Anyone who knows about interviewing, asking questions of anyone, particularly politicians, the follow-up question it makes it about 10 times harder for the politician. What'd Ford do? Said, yeah, we'll have follow-up questions. He gave 200 interviews while he was president. Stunningly enough, he rarely, almost never blamed the press for printing the material that it had obtained. In March 1975, he allowed the author, John Hersey, working for a daily newspaper in New York called the New York Times, to shadow him for a week, to be there the whole time. Not at sensitive national security meetings, but all of the other time, day and night. Can you imagine Bill Clinton doing that? Not very likely. Be much easier to get into the national security meetings. October 74, President Ford, I think in something he probably, I have not asked him this, I think he would reconsider and think maybe he didn't do the right thing in terms of pushing information out. He vetoed an expansion of the Freedom of Information Act, but happily the Congress overrode his veto by very, very large margins. Then one of the other treasure troves of documents here in the library and these are my favorite things: declassified, top secret, sensitive, no dis. Anyone know what no dis means? It means no distribution. In other words, don't give this to anyone. Well, these have been declassified here, and they are the notes of the most sensitive national security meetings involving Ford, Kissinger, Cheney when he was Chief of Staff, Secretary of Defense Schlesinger, and there's one from October 7th, 1974, in which Ford says the following. Classic Ford again. 4 or 5 days ago, I saw a story in the New York Times containing a working paper that I used in my discussions with the Israeli Prime Minister. This morning, I saw another portion in an article containing damaging quotes giving our position, our assessment of Israeli military capability, and so forth. I've been told that the New York Times has so much classified material, they don't know where to store it. This is unforgivable. So what did he do? They talked about maybe the FBI should investigate leaks. And then Ford said, the FBI has troubles in this area. I don't know if they can ever be successful in stopping this. And then he said something I wish some people now in office would take into consideration. And he said, I see this mainly as a management problem in the departments and the agencies. That the problem is you have to convince people, don't leak material. If they do it, it's not the press's fault. And you go through Ford's life and his time as president, particularly when he was in the spotlight, there wasn't this idea of let's blame the press. His lawyer, Phil Buchan, who I got to know very well, and somebody, again, reflective of Ford's style, he just said, we're not going to investigate these leaks. We're not going to prosecute it. The president said it's a management problem, and he said, what we have to do is deterrence is the plan. We're going to try to stop it. We're not going to investigate and prosecute. Seems to me so important. Something else Ford did in March '75, right before the fall of Vietnam. He sent the Army Chief of Staff to South Vietnam to make an independent assessment of the situation. Go, tell me what's going on. You're the four-star general, Chief of Staff of the Army. But he also sent David Kennerly, his photographer, personal photographer, the White House photographer, who had worked for Time magazine, who'd won a Pulitzer Prize, and just said, kind of, David, you go along, see what you see and find out. So the general comes back and says, South Vietnam is salvageable. And if we give them enough military aid, everything's going to be fine. Kennerly goes to the president and says, it's only a matter of weeks until South Vietnam falls and collapses to the communists, and anyone who is telling you otherwise is deceiving you. Ford took it in. A month later, Kennerly's grim forecast came true. Another very important moment in the Ford presidency, in the context of this theme of straight talk. April 23rd, '75, so this is just after the fall of Vietnam. I remember asking Ford about this. He said the fall of Vietnam was the saddest day of his presidency. And then he went to Tulane University and gave a speech about Vietnam. What's important about this speech is it was not vetted or approved by Henry Kissinger, who was his Secretary of State at that point. And Ford went to Tulane and said the following: today, America can regain the sense of pride that existed before Vietnam, but it cannot be achieved by refighting a war that is finished as far as America is concerned. As I see it, the time has come to look forward to an agenda for the future, to unify, to bind up the nation's wounds, and to restore its health and its optimistic self-confidence. In other words, Ford, who'd overseen the moment of withdrawal from Vietnam, stepped up and said, you know what? We can't refight this war. Yes, history is going to debate it, people are going to discuss it, it's part of our heritage, but as a country, we need to move on in this spirit of what he called optimistic self-confidence. He made himself, he didn't hide in the presidency. Not only was he available to people who asked questions like myself, people in the press, but he made himself physically available to the public, even after, you may recall, the two incidents where two women pulled guns on him. I think actually one got a shot off. But that didn't deter Ford. Still went out in public. He would ride in open-top cars and so forth, not deterred at all. This sense of who he was and what his job was persisted after he left the presidency. At the rededication, I guess, of the Gerald Ford Museum about 9 years ago in 1997, he said the following: In the White House, I was called upon to help restore public trust in our government. 20 years later, I fear that we have turned the clock back. Maybe politicians in both parties should ask themselves why the public is so turned off about politics. They might begin by banishing the spin doctors who find their convictions in focus groups and confuse leadership with salesmanship. For in the high-stakes game of history, only those who are willing to lose for principle deserve to win at the polls. So here's a former president proposing that they banish the spin doctors. Suppose they did that in the White House. What would they do with all the vacant office space? As I've had the opportunity to report on seven presidents, going back to Nixon up to the current President George W. Bush, I played with the, it sounds kind of a little abstract, the idea, what's the most important trait a president can have? And obviously you want a president who's smart, who's compassionate, president, who, quite frankly, who's lucky. But when you think about what distinguishes the important great presidents from those who are not, I think probably the most important trait a president can have is courage. And if you look at history, real courage often means walking the road alone. Often means saying, you know, my instincts, the information I have, this is what I'm going to do. This is what it is about. Time and time again, not always, you know, I would argue with everyone, including former President Ford, you know, you need to be more open, you need to give more information. But I think it was in April 2000, 6 years ago, when at the 25th anniversary of the fall of Saigon, at the Nixon Library out in California, they were going to have a symposium on Vietnam, and then they decided, oh, let's cancel it. So they canceled their symposium and didn't deal with Vietnam. What did Ford do? What did the library here do? They reviewed and released 30,000 pages of national security files on Vietnam. Instead of canceling or hiding, they put more out in the open. Just a couple of months ago, November 2005, Hugh Sidey, the Time magazine reporter who covered so many presidents, I think going back to, you know, Franklin Pierce or something like that. He did it so many years, and he had a way of getting to know presidents, and including Ford. And Ford had asked Sidey to speak at his, Gerald Ford's, funeral sometime in the future. Turned out Sidey died first. And so Ford wrote a eulogy that was published in the Washington Post, and Ford said the following: I like reporters, even if I haven't always liked what some wrote about me. I figure that's a pretty minor price to pay for a free press in a free society. Now, I could go on about, there are other examples and so forth. That's just a sampling to give you a sense of who he is. We were talking at dinner about Ford and this question, when you try to understand him and write about, you're pushing hard into that question: who is this person, and what ground will he hold, and also what does he understand and what does he not understand? And in interviews I've done with Ford talking about Nixon and Watergate, what is surprising, Gerald Ford did not understand Watergate. in my opinion. I've spent part of my life on Watergate, and I think I understand it. Ford's view is that Nixon's aides, Haldeman, Ehrlichman, and Colson, caused Watergate, not Nixon. Ford has not listened or examined the Nixon tapes, but as you press, and believe me, I've pressed Ford, and when he offered this view to me that it was, as he said about Nixon, well, there's kind of a 10% quirk factor in Nixon. I almost fell off the chair in despair. 10% quirk factor. Listen to the tapes. Nixon is in charge of the cover-up. Nixon is in charge of the criminality and the abuse of power in his administration. Ford just doesn't agree. Said, I didn't see it that way. He said, I knew Dick Nixon, we were friends. In fact, he goes so far as to say that he was uncomfortable and didn't like what happened to Nixon, that he had to resign, even though Ford became president. He was very, very uncomfortable with that process. He said to me with the kind of conviction, you know, somebody is really telling you the truth. He said, I did not want to be president. I did not seek the presidency, and I think that is absolutely true. He did not understand Watergate or Nixon, in my view. But what is so remarkable is when he took the oath of office as president, and his speechwriter, Bob Hartman, had to almost get down on his knees to get Ford to say in that speech, our long national nightmare is over. But Ford got it, and he said it. And from that moment on, including the pardon, he, even though he didn't understand Nixon or Watergate, in my view, he understood what had to be done and that things needed to be set right, that the poison, and if you listen to the Nixon tapes, you know, I play them on my car radio for the background music. Not quite, but I almost do. I listen and I look at transcripts, and there's the piston driving the Nixon presidency, unfortunately, was hate. And Nixon was a hater. And you go through these tape recordings and you find out all kinds of things, criminality, abuse of power, as I've said, but there was also a smallness in Nixon, which was he almost used the presidency as an instrument of personal revenge. Oh, let's screw so-and-so who didn't do this, and so get this person investigated. I mean, Nixon had the Secret Service tap the telephone of his renegade brother. Now, I think you could argue that to be president, you have to have a renegade brother. Or several. Maybe that's why John Kerry couldn't get elected. But renegade brothers go with the presidency. But using the Secret Service, the agency that's supposed to protect, to spy, only Nixon. This hate, this smallness. Ford was the opposite. He was, you listen to, you look at the national security minutes, what he's always saying, well, what would be right? What would be best? What's going to work? It's all very practical and built around kind of principles of directness, principles, this is going to get out. We're going to have to explain it. So he understood, and that, this is the, I think this will be the next to last point I would make. In any business, including the business of the American presidency, you've got to understand what the job is about. And it's not in the Constitution. It's not in a sense, it comes from inside. And what the job is about is different. every moment in history. Sometimes it requires toughness, sometimes it requires softness, sometimes it requires, as Ford has said, healing, that the instinctive and intellectual realization that the country had been wounded and he had to heal it. I just want to tell this anecdote because it's vivid in my own personal recollections. When Carl Bernstein and I were working on the Watergate story, we'd written these stories in 1972 about Nixon and his people, and most people did not believe them. Most of our colleagues at the Washington Post didn't believe it. And the editors did, and they supported us, as did Katharine Graham, who was the publisher and owner of the Washington Post. And in January of 1973, Katharine Graham invited me up to her dining room for lunch. And I remember walking in, and she looks at me and just kind of had this look on her face of, "What have you boys been doing with my newspaper?" Because we had put the Washington Post journalistically out on a limb, on a limb, on a limb. We were in peril. People didn't believe it. And she had a wonderful management style, which I've later described as mind on, hands off. She knew all of the questions to ask. Incredibly informed. She said, "Henry Kissinger says this about Bob Haldeman, Nixon's chief of staff." She read things, she heard things. I remember she said, "Oh, I read in the Chicago Tribune and this about something about Watergate." And I remember thinking, what's she reading the damn Chicago Tribune for? She's got a much better newspaper. But she did, through a broad net. And then she came at the end to the killer question. The CEO with the killer question for the lowly employee. I was 29 years old at this time. And she said, when are we going to find out the whole truth about Watergate? Reasonable question for the boss. And I said, Carl Bernstein and I felt, because after all, it was a criminal conspiracy, because Nixon knew how to silence people, scare them, and the Nixon team did. They knew how to compartmentalize information, that it was very difficult, that there was a massive orchestrated, well-financed cover-up going on. And so my answer was never. We're never going to find out the whole story. And I remember sitting at that lunch table, and she had this pain-stricken, beleaguered look on her face. She said precisely the following. Looked at me and she said, "Never, don't tell me never." I left that lunch a motivated employee. But the very important never, don't tell me never, was not a threat. It was a statement of purpose. Katharine Graham knew what the job was. The job of the newspaper is to go out, and what she said that day was, use your resources, the resources of this newspaper, and get to the bottom of it. We have an obligation not just to ourselves, but if this is true, and she said, I believe it's true, what is going on? What has happened? Where is our country? And that's exactly, I mean, and it is what Ford did in his own way at the moment he got that job, unexpectedly. I mean, I don't know how many months earlier, when it was, December 73, he became vice president. So it was less than a year, am I right? He went from being a congressman in whatever district in Grand Rapids it was to the presidency. That's, George W. Bush had a fast rise, but Gerald Ford's was much faster. And so with this thrust on him, he figured out exactly what the job was. Last thing I'd mention, a number of years ago, the head of Simon & Schuster, which has published all of my books, took me to dinner in New York City. And when the boss takes you to dinner, that means something is up. That's really important. Good news or bad news. And we sat down, and he said, "Okay, Woodward, what's your next book going to be?" And I said, "Well, I wanted to do some reading and reporting and thinking and pick the right subject." He looked at me and he said, "Reading, reporting, thinking? Are you crazy? We are in the marketing and the product delivery business. Why don't you get to work? Get off your rear end. What's your next book going to be? Come on." Really pumping it very hard and throughout the whole dinner. And at the end of the dessert course, I said, "I figured out what my next book is going to be." And he said, "Well, at last. What is it?" And I said, "Well, my next book is going to be on the publishing business in New York City." And he said, that's terrific. I have a great title for you. I said, "Great title? I don't think there are any great titles left." And he said, "There's one. Your book on the publishing business in New York City will be called My Last Book." He really meant it. It's the most sincere thing the man ever said. The book has not yet been written, but it will someday. Thank you very much. I enjoyed it. Good. How much time for questions? Questions? I don't know. You have a microphone. Oh, great.
Stephen Ambrose, in his last book, wrote all the things he taught wrong as a college history professor. And you've already mentioned that you changed your mind on the pardon. Are there one or two other things that you've changed your mind on that you believed in previously?
You don't want to stay here all night. Just lots. Let me just tell you something that's current. I'm doing the third book on Bush now. I've done two, Bush at War, about the war in Afghanistan, plan of attack, about the decision to invade Iraq. And we were talking tonight at dinner about how good history is and do you get the information. I interviewed Bush for plan of attack for 3.5 hours. Really an excavation of his decision-making process over 16 months. And it was a researcher at the Washington Post has checked, and as best we can tell, it's the longest interview a sitting president ever gave on a single subject. And the last day in the Oval Office, the last question I asked him, I said, "How do you think history will judge your Iraq war?" And he had his hands in his pockets, and he was standing, and he took his hands out, and he kind of shrugged, and he, "History?" Like it's far off, and said, "History, we won't know. We'll all be dead." Now, he's ducking the question, but it's a profound point. You don't know. 56 years ago, Harry Truman's president, Korean War, 22% approval rating. Bush, about half of Bush's now. Truman thought to be inadequate in the presidency, a fool. And historians like David McCullough come along and say, "Oh, no. Korean War necessary, Truman Doctrine essential, Marshall Plan brilliant." The kind of plain speaking, I'm not going to put that stuff out. magnificent, and Truman's now thought to be generally as one of the great presidents. So it looks different. So that causes you always to pause in your judgments. And, you know, look at the Iraq War. How many people here now, based on what you know now, think the war in Iraq was probably necessary or wise? Bravely raise your hands. How many think, probably based on what you know now, it was unwise or unnecessary or overwhelming? This is a university town, but I tell you, you can go to a business group and the proportions are the same. It is an incredibly unpopular war. Preponderance of the evidence now, not good, to say the least. May look at it very differently. And, you know, someday they may be putting monuments to George W. Bush in downtown Baghdad. Don't count on it. Sir.
Beginning of August 1974, I was a White House fellow and working with Ford's staff on a trip for him when the word came that he was not to leave town. And President Nixon went before the public to announce what I described as his retirement. It was really out of keeping with the circumstances. I'm just curious whether you or people older than you were at the time were fearful in Washington that the Nixon administration would actually declare the next election unnecessary and take extraordinary action to stay in power.
No, I don't think so. There was, there was some worry about it. Some people had, but as Nixon said, in fairness, to give Nixon some due anyway, he impeached himself. He did. He voluntarily resigned, and he didn't have to. And it spared himself and the country an incredible ordeal. Imagine what an impeachment and trial of Richard Nixon on all of those crimes with all of the tape record. I mean, it would have been bloody. So, but I don't think there was any sense that there was going to be a coup or hold power or something like that.
Do you get the sense that Gerald Ford saved the Republican Party?
Whether Ford saved the Republican Party?
In addition to his other accomplishments.
Well, some people wouldn't think that would be an accomplishment. I just want to retain my neutral position. Well, what happened to the Republican Party afterwards? Vietnam and Watergate elected Jimmy Carter. I remember saying to Carter once, "You're a Watergate baby." And he said, yes, he agreed. I don't know. I think what the Ford presidency in an interesting way was, I never looked at it, and maybe, Christine, as we look at this, we need to, through a partisan lens. So I'm not, it's an interesting question, though. Let's put it on our list of unanswered questions. Sir.
Would you say something? Would you say something about the selection of Ford after Agnew was kicked out?
Yes. Nixon won, Agnew resigned in a financial scandal, and Nixon had to pick a successor. And of course, what Nixon wanted to do is pick John Connally, the former Texas governor. Nixon thought Connally was just great and strong, but Connally was too controversial and couldn't get through. You had Reagan on the right and Rockefeller on the left in the party, and there was a feeling they might not be able to be confirmed because under the 25th Amendment, I think that's the right amendment, isn't it? The new vice president had to be confirmed by both houses. And so, as Nixon wrote in his memoir, that left Jerry Ford. It's not a strong compliment, and I think that's classic Nixon, and I think historians will revisit that issue, and I think it's one of the things Christine and I are working on, is we're trying to gather material on President Ford, exactly what happened there and what was the Nixon-Ford relationship, and I think it's more complicated. Like, you know, the more you dig, the more you find out. Nixon's one-liner in his memoirs, which is "That left Jerry Ford," doesn't tell the story. Sir?
You knew the Nixon White House obviously very well, and you know the current White House very well. We know that there are now being some parallels drawn between them. John Dean said what Nixon did wasn't nearly as bad as, you know, wiretapping American citizens. Now, I'm not going to get into that, but what I would like you to do...
I'll be happy to.
Well, you have the license. My question is, what are the parallels between the two? How are they the same? How are they different?
You know, they're based on what we know now, they're very different. Evidence of all kinds of crimes. I mean, when I talked to Ford about this, Ford said if he'd been a member of the House, he would have voted to impeach Nixon. Clearly, Nixon committed impeachable offenses. Any lawyer looking at the record would say he committed crimes. I think there are, you can certainly debate a lot of the things that George W. Bush has done. Wiretapping, listening in on, you know, America, you said American citizens. Well, as I understand it, and I think this is true, the order was to listen to the phone calls of suspected terrorists who happen to be American citizens or happen to be in this country, talking to somebody abroad. Now, I think you can argue, you know, the legal issues, and they are very substantial. I'm not sure in the weeks after 9/11 that wasn't reasonable. Now, whether that's reasonable now or a year later, but I don't see any based on what we know now. Now, there may be massive criminality here. I certainly, you know, would leave that open, but based on the evidence available now, I don't see it. I mean, how many, you're counselor to the President of the United States in the weeks after 9/11, and it turns out you can't listen in to these suspected terrorists, and there aren't that many who happen to be in this country. President says, should I sign this order giving the National Security Agency this authority? How many of you would probably say, yeah, you ought to? Raise your hands. How many think you wouldn't? More said yes. Now, whether 6 months later and so forth. So I think that's a different thing. At the same time, that's not to say it's right or wise. I'm not sure, I haven't seen any evidence of illegality or criminality. I'm sorry. I mean, maybe illegal. Courts may say we would not allow this, but that doesn't mean somebody's going to go to jail for it. Ma'am.
For those of us who don't listen to the Nixon tapes in our car frequently, which day should we single out? Do you have a day that would be great to listen to for us to truly understand the Nixon White House?
Oh, you're asking for my top 10.
Yeah, your top 10.
There are just too many. There really are. The ones that led to his resignation are the June 23rd, 1972 tapes, 6 days after the Watergate burglary, when he orders the CIA to ask the FBI to restrict their investigation because it might get into some CIA operation, which was not true. It was a national security cover for an illegal political espionage operation, and that'll get you going. After you listen to that, I'll be happy to give you other dates. It's a great question, sir.
President can be a crook or a thief or whatever, criminal, and get away with it, and sets the tone that the government won't hold him accountable for those activities. Isn't that setting a tone which some people are saying applies to Bush today?
You know, that's the question, and we have to know more about it. But based on what I know now, I don't see that criminality quite frankly. I think you can debate it to the end of the earth, and it may turn out that a court would say, no, he doesn't have that power. But we are, I think I quote Bush in one of my books talking about lawyers, and he just says, aren't lawyers dreadful? And the issue of the National Security Agency, I guess the best comparison, Nixon said he had the power to keep his tapes secret and didn't have to give them to the prosecutor, and it went to the Supreme Court, and he lost 8-0 unanimously. He had to turn over the tapes, but no one then said, you made a false legal claim, you go to jail for asserting that right. In this case, Bush is asserting that as president, he has the right to conduct intelligence operations to protect the country. I think you can certainly strongly, passionately argue against it, but once that goes to a court, Supreme Court, if it comes back 9-0, you lose, they aren't going to send George Bush to jail for it, or he's not going to be impeached for that single. It is a legal argument that if the courts accepted it, would say, yeah, it's something you can argue this way or that way, and we'll resolve it. But for asserting a certain right, losers don't go to jail on issues like this that are not criminal, at least at this point. Yes.
You understandably write about a lot of contemporary issues. If you had a time machine, name a presidency or 2 or 3 that you would love to have been able to go back to and have this kind of fun exploring. Oh,
well, I mean, all of them. If you look at the history, say, of Lincoln, there aren't the kind of interviews in depth that were conducted of Lincoln that some reporter, I talked to Bush, what did you do here? Why? What did you feel? What did Cheney say? It's a really intimate record of a contemporary president giving his reasoning and his action. And so I think it enriches. Now, if you could have a time machine and go back, and you would do that at the great moments in history. And I think sometimes I find myself reading some of those histories, and I find them a little bland. It often seems the emotions are bleached out. And one of the questions I frequently will ask as a reporter of people is, where are the emotions for you in this situation? Now, you don't need to ask George W. Bush that, because he'll tell you. But the emotions are very important. We live emotional lives, and the more you get off in history, sometimes I think the people who record what occurred don't capture those emotions and don't capture a lot of the dialogue. I mean, that's why here at the Ford Library, these national security minutes, they had great note takers. I mean, this is that meeting of October 7th, 74, 22 delicious pages. If it was on tape, I'd put it in my car radio. Such a junkie. Yes, sir. I'm sorry, you've got.
You mentioned earlier, this is related to an earlier question, but you mentioned earlier that Gerald Ford didn't really understand the culpability of Nixon in the Watergate conspiracy. He wasn't alone in that. There were lots of other people. In fact, my mother-in-law didn't get it. And
there's always one. Is that your mother-in-law next to you?
No,
former mother-in-law. Okay.
But I wonder whether the electorate was denied a civics lesson when President Ford pardoned Nixon, and also I wonder whether subsequent presidents might have exceeded their authority with impunity as a result of that experience.
I don't think so. As I was trying to say earlier, I think by preserving the Nixon tapes, that's the real history of the Nixon presidency. I've had the chance to cover some criminal trials, and they're battles, and they're often not very good history because you have strong advocates on both sides. And I'd much rather have, and I think history is richer because we have the Nixon tapes, and anyone who takes office as president is aware of the legacy of Watergate. I think President Bush will let me come interrogate him. And you know, it's all on the record, no limitations on questions. We had some real tough back and forths when I asked about things like, what was your father's recommendation on the Iraq War? We spent 8 minutes on that question, 8 unpleasant minutes, because I would not let the question go. And it's when he finally said something that's been quoted, well, in terms of strength, I appeal to a higher father. And never got the answer to what the lower father's recommendation was. One of the gaps in the story. But Bush is willing to do that because I think he has a sense of that you have to answer, and I think he does not answer enough. I think it is a secretive White House. Most White Houses are, particularly modern ones. I think it should be much more open, but it's extraordinary that he would come in and let somebody like me kind of say, okay, I've really got some good questions on why you made the most important decision you made as president, going to war in Iraq. And so I think the lesson of Watergate has been internalized by lots of people, including presidents, and I hope we don't lose a sense of it. I see that it is taught in history classes in high school and in college, and it's part of the legacy and that runs very, very deep. I wrote this book, Shadow, about the 5 presidents in the legacy of Watergate. And they all had their battles with the new environment of independent counsels for a while, more aggressive press, a very aggressive Congress, particularly if it's controlled by the other party. So I'm not worried.
Were you surprised when the family of Deep Throat made the announcement, and what was their motivation?
Yes, I was surprised about a year ago when the family and lawyer for Mark Felt, who was the #2 in the FBI, disclosed that he was Deep Throat, one of our Watergate sources. We had kept that secret for 33 years. You know, who is the Russian novelist who said the only way 3 people can keep a secret is if 2 of them are dead. But we kept that secret. And the family, I think, wanted him to get some credit. His lawyer has a book coming out this month. I have no idea what it's going to say. And hopefully it will add to the record, because I wrote a book, The Secret Man, which outlines my end and as I understood his motives. But by the time I got to him 6 years ago, he's in fact almost the exact age of Gerald Ford, 92, 93, and unlike Ford, Mark Felt, his memory's gone. So, you know, I eagerly await the book, the long-awaited book.
Teddy Roosevelt said that to be a good muckraker, you have to be honest and you have to be sane. And I'm wondering if our journalists today are honest and sane, or if they're also just kind of taken away with the speed of giving news, and therefore they can't always be quite so sane.
Yeah. You know, in the internet and cable television world, the driving forces are speed and impatience. And I think it leads to a lot of nonsense. When we worked on the Watergate stories, we could write a story, do a draft. We wrote on things called typewriters. Remember those, some of you? And it was an original 6-ply paper, 5 carbon copies. The editors would look at it, question us. What about this? Get more information. How can this be true? I read in the Chicago Tribune. And so then you would chase down, and we'd work weeks on a story and be published. Now you have something that looks like an incremental advance, and an editor will be in your office and say, can we get it on the website by 6 a.m.? And so all good work is related to time against the problem. Do you have time to work on it? And if it's, the Washington Post, after we went to war in Iraq, said to me, take a year and find out why we went to war in Iraq. What happened? And then I had that luxury of interviewing low-level, mid-level people, working up and putting together an account that has stood the test of time. But these things, running. A couple of years ago, the Kobe Bryant sexual allegations in Colorado, I was watching cable news. It was CNN, and the anchor said, we're going to our reporter live in Colorado outside the hearing for Kobe Bryant. The reporter got on and she said, I'm here outside the courthouse up there, and Kobe Bryant's lawyers aren't talking. The judge isn't talking, the prosecutors aren't talking. I know nothing, but I'm here live. You know what she said next? She said, stand by. I'll be back in an hour to tell you I know nothing live. So we go around and take incremental, but somehow there's almost a distrust, I guess, or something, that people feel they're going to, the really good live stuff is going to be bleeped out or cut out. It's just, it isn't the way it is. And so what you have to do, go to Katharine Graham's model. Never. Don't tell me never. Get to the bottom of it. Take the time. And the newspaper or television or a book is just like any other product. Will somebody look at it and say, hey, this is really useful? If it's useful, the business or the book or the newspaper thrive. If it's not, it's a marketplace. In the old days, old newspaper days, you know what a bacon cooler is? No one in Michigan knows what a bacon cooler is. Wow. Okay. A bacon cooler is a story you have in a newspaper that's so good that when people are at the breakfast table and they have speared the bacon and they're reading the newspaper, they're so amazed and surprised and stunned that the bacon gets cold on the fork. That's a bacon cooler. Thanks.